Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Hi. It's really awesome to be here in person. I have to say, just on like an emotional note, this was the first conference. Whoop.
It just beeps. You're ready. It just
Okay. I was like, what's happening? That got scary. This was the first ever Agile conference I ever went to, and I was a volunteer with DevJam, so it's super special for me to be here 9 years later speaking. So thank you so much for coming to my talk today. So what we're talking about here is psychological safety practices safely produce better products is a mouthful. I considered that when I wrote it. I was like, alliteration's fun, except not really to say. A few things that you're going to learn here today. So we're going to talk about people and products. How do we connect the two? What does it mean for us to put people first when we're thinking about products? We're going to also talk a little bit about data. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with folks around what sort of data do we need to have to actually get leaders to listen to how important this stuff is. And then we're going to talk about building healthy spaces starting with self. We're going to talk about listening to our own reactions and then how to measure progress over time. Before I get here, I'm actually going to start with this. Has anybody seen this image before? Clear, a few folks. Okay, can I see a show of hands of who is aware of what a working agreement is? Awesome. So this is where we're going to start today. I could spend an entire session on working agreements, but for the sake of time, this is how we want to start today. Since I'm going to be asking you all to volunteer some possibly vulnerable information, we want to start with being clear. So this is something we at Industrial Logic use just as a starting off point to really have a safe space, to be able to speak up, to be curious and open-minded, to listen to each other, to encourage everyone to contribute. Try not to dominate or interrupt, at least no Zoom interrupting, right? I think I'd rather have in-person interrupting at this point. And repeat and review people's points. Can I just see a show of hands if we're all good with these agreements? Awesome. Well, let's move backwards then forwards. All right, so I'm Tara. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Industrial Logic as a coach. And I am also a fearless organization practitioner. You might be asking yourself, what the heck is that? If anyone here is familiar with Amy Edmondson, the person who pioneered the term psychological safety, I was certified to go into organizations and actually measure the safety of leaders, teams, executives, the entire organization. I worked for 10 years in the healthcare system, which included working in mental health care, and then I got laid off and was down the road from DevJam, and David Hussman gave me a job. Super lucky. I had no idea who he was or what agility was, and now here I am. A big reason that I got into this work is because of where I began in healthcare and how I watched folks in mental health care not just struggle in terms of showing up as patients and being able to work on what they needed to work on. But I was a manager at a clinic, and I was way too young, for the record. When you're 25 and you're a manager of a bunch of people, it's scary. But I watched people not being able to express themselves because they were afraid to. I watched people resisting their true selves because they were afraid of getting in trouble, or they were afraid of their boss not being okay with what they were saying, and it really kind of lit a fire in me. And as I continued in technology, I saw the same thing happening, but it was almost worse because we're expected to just collaborate, and we throw a bunch of people together, and it's like, okay, go build this amazing thing, and hopefully it'll work because you guys trust each other, right? And then everybody sits there and stares and doesn't say anything because these things don't happen overnight. What you see in this picture is my dad and I. So my dad worked for IBM for 25 years. During that time, he was in sales, marketing, he was a trainer, a coach, and every morning as a kid, I watched him doubled over in stress, drinking his coffee as he shook, just internally dealing with all of the stress he knew he was going to meet that day. And I know this because he has since told me that. He had a psychotic break about 17 years ago, and he told me a lot of the impact from that was because he had all of this stress that he didn't know what to do with. And I kind of made it my mission to recognize that we have to be able to be humans and employees at the same time. It can be both, and it is both. We don't have our work selves and our people selves. I'm not going to go into the whole thing about your work is your family, because that would go on for like 2 hours because you'd get me up on my soapbox, but I think it's really important to show up as a human, and not only that, to have leaders recognize how much amazing work we can produce when we're invited to show up as ourselves. The biggest thing for me is that agility emerges from people who are functioning as human beings. It's not about being robots. Has anyone here ever read Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano? It's kind of a deep cut, yeah. It was his first novel, and it actually is all about humans being replaced by machines. And if you listen to the keynote, there's a lot of talk about like how are we being replaced, and what does that really look like, and how do we get to know ourselves? So let's dig into that. Why do we put people first? So as I mentioned, I'm a coach. I go in and measure teams. I do all sorts of stuff. But when I meet with folks on teams and I ask them, you know, what are your biggest challenges? I hear a lot about deliverables. Even if I'm there for organizational behavior work, I'll hear about deliverables. They'll say, we're not working fast enough, blah, blah, blah. It's all this pressure. What I'm really listening for is for that leader to recognize that he needs, or she or they need to talk about the humans that are behind the work that they're doing. Has anyone here ever heard people be referred to as resources? Do you love being referred to as a resource? No, it makes you feel inhuman. It makes you feel like a number and a cog and replaceable, and nobody wants that. So really, when I start having these conversations with leaders, even if it's a leader internally on a team, do they recognize that they need to focus on the people as well as the work? And so that's where the hard stuff really begins. So some data points that I find really important. $600 billion a year is lost from employee turnover. I'm not sure if anyone here saw the statistic that was circling the internet in November or December about how 4.1 million people quit November of last year. I'm actually really glad for that statistic. It takes a certain amount of privilege to be able to do something like that. However, I'm glad people are finding their voice and being able to recognize when they're not being treated as they should be, and they want to explore something else and move on. Additionally, managers who rate highly as leaders who promote psychological safety lead teams who bring in $4.3 million more than leaders who don't. I can't tell you how many executives I've met with who have dismissed psychological safety as something fluffy, something that you can't measure, which was part of the reason that I went and got certified, because I'm not a certification person. And if anybody knew David Hussman, you know why I felt that way. But to me, I thought, I need to get this conversation started somehow. How can I make this the catalyst for something else? And that's why I really started getting into this work. Collaboration can't just be about warm bodies. If anybody has heard of Theory X, where we just continue to throw people at a problem, it doesn't solve the issue. What really needs to happen is we need to dig into ourselves. It can't be about trying to fix whatever's wrong technically. It can't be about, oh, well, we just don't have a good enough DevOps pipeline. This is regardless of industry. It's regardless of the organization. It needs to be about people who can show up and speak their minds freely. So, as I mentioned, Amy Edmondson, I'm kind of a fangirl, pioneered psychological safety. She wrote a book in 1998 about teaming and the fearless organization. And it started as, she didn't start by getting into psychological safety. The whole purpose of her writing her thesis before the book was measuring errors in hospitals. And what she discovered was the folks who actually asked questions made less errors because they were unafraid to speak up. But when doctors were on call, when nurses felt uncomfortable with a dialogue, anyone ever watch Scrubs, Dr. Cox? Yes, he's fictional, but also not. They were really afraid to speak their mind, and when they didn't, they made mistakes that could be really dire. Psychological safety is about showing up in a way without fear of being judged or punished. And what I really think is most interesting about the definition of it, and we talk about this in the workshop that I teach, is that it's shared by members of a team, that the team is safe. So what it isn't, it's not about one person. One person cannot say, yep, our team's psychologically safe. I actually just wrote something on LinkedIn about that because I met with a group and I said, you know, what sort of behavior do you all feel as a team that you would like to see more of? And the leader piped up and said, well, we're psychologically safe here, we're good. And guess how many other people on the team spoke up after that? None. Nobody said anything. It's also not a static state. It can't be a declaration that this is the way we are. That's like saying, I'm super sad. forever. Like, I'm not sad forever. It's something that I'm going to feel for now, and then I'm going to change and flow. So just like anything else with agility, this is something that is going to be dynamic. It's going to move and shift. So this work has to start with the self. This means understanding the good, the bad, and the ugly about yourself. How do you show up in the world? What are your triggers? And this might sound like a self-therapy session, and it kind of is. Because at the end of the day, what happens if we were to start focusing on team instead of self? Just shout it out. What if we just started with a team? Like, what's their problem?
It's easy to place blame over there.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, old neighbor. Yeah.
Hi, old neighbor.
Exactly. Super easy to place blame, right? And it's way easier to do that. It's like, cool, that's your problem, not mine. But at the end of the day, if you don't start with yourself, we're projecting. There's something that I'm going to bring up way later in the slide deck, but has anyone here heard of the responsibility process? It's something super awesome I will get to eventually in this, but basically what Bill McCarley and Christopher Avery did, the two folks who created this, is it's a way of really owning our own behavior. We cannot control what other people do, but we can control our response to what they do. So again, this is about really getting to know yourself. What makes you upset? What makes you feel triggered? And what does trigger really mean for you? I know this word has been thrown around a lot lately. I'm going to give you an example of something that might be triggering for me. Many years ago, I had a leader who got really frustrated with something, and I'm wondering if the other person who was there is in this room. I'm not sure. And witnessed our boss throwing a phone at a wall, and the phone shattered. And it was super scary. So for a while, actually no, I bet still to this day, if I'm with another leader, and by the way, leader can mean anyone who leads people. I'm not talking about like a C-suite or an executive. It can be anyone. You all lead. But if I'm talking with someone and they start getting really fired up and I notice that it's just building, I kind of have this like wince. Like I'm like, oh, that's that thing. But for me to know that, I have to think back about, oh, why am I reacting that way? And so that's what this work is all about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the amygdala hijack. Who here has heard of the amygdala hijack before? Quite a few folks. Awesome. Neuroscience is super cool and really complicated, and I understand about 2% of it, but this part is super pertinent to the work that I do. So the amygdala is located towards the front of our brain, and it stimulates intense emotions. It's the lizard brain. It is what has kept us alive as cave people when we were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger or a T-Rex with super teeny tiny arms but a big mouth. It was what kept us alive. But when that happens, the frontal lobe, the part of our brain that is logical, isn't able to function. So when we're scared or freaked out or we witness someone throwing a phone at a wall, we can't react rationally because we're thinking, how do I survive this? And that doesn't, sometimes it can lead to great decisions like running into your cave and being safe, or it can lead to us flying off the handle, all sorts of things. So it's really important to listen to what your body and your brain tell you. I'm not going to dig into a bunch of neuroscience on this today other than this. And has anyone here ever heard of like polyvagal theory, which is about your nervous system? I actually do a separate talk on that, but your nervous system, when you feel yourself like shaking when you get nervous, AKA me about 5 minutes before I came in here, that's your nervous system like shaking stuff off. So when you find yourself in those stressful moments, listen to your body because it's going to tell you before your brain even knows what's going on. So we're going to dig into that for a second. So I'm going to give you an example. I want you to pretend you just got this email. I want you to listen to how your body responds. What does it feel like? And what do you want to say back to this person? Dear so-and-so, see email below. Apparently you haven't had a chance to get to this yet since I've heard nothing from you. Did you not understand something? Get me a status ASAP. Best. What comes up for you when you read this? Right. F you, man. Whatever. Do you feel anything physically? If you can bring yourself to a moment in time where you may have gotten an email like this, what does it feel like? Physical tension, yeah? Well, getting ready to fight. Yeah. Absolutely. All these things go through our head. It's also an email, so all we can deduce from this is whatever's in front of us. The 5 F's, trauma response. Are folks in here familiar, have heard of trauma response before? It's something often referred to in psychology, and there are different versions of trauma responses. There's 4 F's, there's 5 F's. These are the 5 that I have done the most research on and have seen be the most impactful within organizations. So the first is fight. You might get this and be like, F you, I want to punch you, come at me. Luckily, hopefully you're over Zoom and you can't do that in the immediate moment, but maybe. Second is flight. You want to take off. You don't want to even think about this right now. The third is freeze, and that is different than flight because you're not able to do anything. It's not even about taking off. There's a phenomenal book that I have listed in my sources at the end of this that'll be available in the deck called The Body Keeps the Score, if anyone's ever read that. It's a book all about trauma and how we hold things in our body and how it comes out in all these ways, just like I talked about the phone incident. And there's a story about a woman and a man who are in a terrible car accident. It's like a multi-car crash, and one of the spouses gets out to help with other people pulling them out of cars, and the other person just sits there and stares and stares and is like that for months until she can actually start to work on these things. Now, not all of these situations are as grandiose as that, but we have, microaggressions. We have these mini communications all the time, all day. So imagine if we're just bouncing all around these and not able to think from a calm place. That's going to be really tough for us. The fourth one's interesting. So the fourth one is fawn. And fawn would be if that boss of mine who had thrown the phone against the wall, I had just run up to them and been like, hey, are you okay? I'm sorry, what are you mad about? It's kind of just like trying to brush things under the rug and not really get to the root of the problem. And I think a lot of Minnesotans, for those of us in Minnesota, do we do that? Yes, a little bit. And the fifth one is flop. So the flop is just you're done. And usually that happens when something has happened a repeated amount of times. Did this email remind you of anything you may have seen over and over and over again from someone who might be a little micromanagey, who never seems to get enough, even though you keep trying to show up for them? You might find yourself in that flop position. It's exhausting, right? So we're going to talk about once you feel those things, what do you do with it? So you find yourself getting this email, you're feeling pretty frustrated, and it's like, okay, well, now what? Now that I'm aware of it, what do I do with it? Who here is familiar with Gottman's 4 Horsemen? Awesome. Does feel a little bit like a therapy session today, but that's okay. So, Gottman's 4 Horsemen. The two doctors, Dr. and Dr. Gottman, are a married couple, and they have been working for 40 years in marriage counseling. And they have gotten this down to a science where they believe that they can recognize whether a couple will stay together simply by the behavior that they present with and whether or not they are able to work through some of the behavior that they have. So we're going to walk through these. So the first is criticism. And I want you to remember, we just talked about the 5 F's, but think about what happens when we experience those things. Let's say we're in fight. What about criticism? So this might be a behavior response to what we've just felt. Criticism isn't like constructive criticism. It's not a compliment sandwich. Criticism is just kind of going for the gut and saying, this is your problem. It's a lot of you can also tie a lot of body motions to this. It's like, this is your problem, you did this. Contempt, I think that this probably happens more often than not now on Zoom, but eye rolling, just feeling really annoyed by someone. It's that feeling where they walk in the room and you kind of do this. It's just really not respecting them. We probably say, maybe we're passive aggressive to them. To our friends, we're going to be like, hey, this person, not the greatest. Defensiveness. This one is tough because I think that when we find ourselves in a position where we're being accused of something, especially something we didn't do, of course we want to defend ourselves. But when defensiveness looks like we just feel attacked, we really can't, sorry about the mic pop, we really can't go anywhere with that because then we're just defensive. I'm going to give you an example. I have a family member who has a tendency to have a tough time listening. Active listening. If folks have heard of active listening versus passive, right? So you're paying attention to what's being heard. And I've tried to give this person asked for advice on how to listen better. And often I'm met with, well, you don't understand, and I'm super busy, and I'm not able to concentrate, and blah, 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 blah. And it just becomes defensiveness. And there's really no point in having those conversations then, because when the amygdala is responding, you can't hear. At least you can't hear logically. And last, we have stonewalling. Who else has witnessed this in Minnesota? A couple times. Minnesota ice. For those of you who are not from Minnesota, so there's something called Minnesota nice, where we're like super nice and polite, but not really. I was born in Boston, so I got a little different flavor. But I love Minnesota, and I love Minnesotans, but Minnesota ice is like, if you haven't been in our circle forever, it's real tough to break in. And so stonewalling can kind of look like withdrawing from interactions. It's just not responding, shutting down, and when you get an email like this, who wants to respond to that? All right, so we're going to walk through a little exercise here. So I want you to think about this, and what we've just walked through, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. I want you to think about someone accusing you of doing or saying something that is completely untrue. Who here feels like they want to criticize them? Nobody. How about contempt? Defensiveness. Who feels defensive? Yeah. That's not true. Stonewalling. There's no right or wrong answer here, by the way. We all have different responses to this. Yeah. Right. It's like, I don't want to deal with you. I wish that I could go to that one more often, but I can't. There's someone, we're going to try another one. So there's someone you work closely with who is a rambler. They constantly take meetings off topic, and they always run over time. Do you feel criticism? Give yourself a second to digest. Contempt. Defensiveness. Stonewalling. Yeah. So let's say this happens, and we're feeling contempt for this person. What do we do? And you can just shout it out. Like, so somebody's running meetings over time. What do we do? How do we address it? Mm-hmm. Show up late. Right. Yeah. How would we address this problem? Or do we want to? We find ourselves in a Zoom meeting. It's Zoom, so it's tough, right? We're not in person. I'm just using the most, common denominator at this point. And somebody always comes to the Zoom meeting 15 minutes late. We all know it's going to happen. Who's going to speak up and say something? Or do we find ourselves so in contempt that, why bother? It depends. Right. If it's somebody we don't know very well in the team, we might not say anything. If it's somebody we already don't like, we're either going to not say anything or we're going to say something that might not be super nice. So how do we approach these problems? We face these every single day in our world now. And not just at work, at home, with family, with friends. And I will tell you that this work, number one, I will never stop learning about the human condition because I make mistakes every day in terms of behavior. I made one this morning with my partner on the way in. I was like, this is the dog's fault because we're late. And I was like, nope, that's you. You just took a long time getting ready. And I owned it about 5 minutes later. But it takes time to get there, and sometimes you don't own it, and you act like a jerk. And the purpose isn't to say, oh man, I'm a terrible human being, I don't get this right. It's building awareness. And if we start with ourselves and being aware of our own behavior, we can make huge changes in the ecosystems around us. So your feelings are valid, and there's another way. So we don't have to say like, hey, so-and-so, you suck and you never show up on time. We can say things like a gentle startup. Maybe we can find a way to say, you know what, your input's really needed in these meetings, and I feel like it's kind of tough when we're not all here, so is this time not good for you? Maybe we can find something else. Maybe instead of contempt, we can start talking about what we appreciate about each other. Instead of defensiveness, taking responsibility. I mentioned the responsibility process. There are lots of ways for us to say, you know what, maybe I did do this thing, and I can own that, and it's okay. I feel like the pendulum swings so hard now, and it's really been difficult, especially the past few years, where when we do something wrong, we're so cruel to ourselves. And we don't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. We can own responsibility, but it's often shared. And we can only own our own behavior. And then stonewalling, physiological self-soothing. Who here uses an app like Calm or has used something like that? Have you found it helpful? If you use it, not like me who has it on my phone and I never use it. Finding ways to do deep breathing or breathing the opposite sides of the nostril, I actually did that right before I came to talk in here, and it really helps you relax. And when you relax, you can come back to that logical place. You're not gonna be so hot-headed. In terms of polyvagal theory and the nervous system, that's called being in heightened arousal. So here's an example. When you watch nature videos and you see a gazelle running, and there's a cheetah running after it, and it's run, 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 and then you watch it drop right before the cheetah gets it, and I would always be like, why does it do that? Its nervous system literally just shuts down. But then if the cheetah gets distracted because it sees another gazelle or it sees hyenas hanging out waiting for leftovers, the gazelle will again boost right up into heightened arousal and take off. We do the same type of thing. Same stuff. It's about getting us back to that place where we can be a little more even-keeled and make some better decisions. If anyone's here familiar with Viktor Frankl, wonderful writer, Holocaust survivor, this is one of my favorite quotes, and we use it in the psychological safety workshop that I teach. Between stimulus and space, there is a response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. We never give ourselves time to slow down. And we never give ourselves time to not just react, but process. Sometimes we don't have the ability to do that. But I'd love to challenge you to say, in those moments where it feels really tough and where you feel like maybe you're starting to pay attention to when you get thrown into these states, maybe you're doing some criticizing or feeling contempt, to say, can we just take 5 minutes to take a break? Because more often than not, people will respect that you just need a minute. And we don't give ourselves that. We feel like we don't have that option. And again, sometimes we don't. But I would challenge all of us, including myself, to continue to try to give ourselves a little more space and a little more grace. So when we reflect more on how we work, we are going to be so much more empathetic and more aware of others in our circle. So we have self in the middle because we have to start with self. Once we start really getting to know ourselves, we can start working with other people in a different way. In the psychological safety workshop that I teach, we have 2 sessions a week. One is for learning and one is for applied learning. In the learning section during the week, we actually have people go experiment in real time on their teams with a few things. We don't boil the ocean and try everything at once. It won't work and people's heads will explode. But give yourself one thing that you might want to try. And then at the end of the week, they come back and we talk about it as a group. What happened? What worked? What went well? What were you more aware of? And when you start paying attention to your own behavior and the behavior of others, it's just fascinating how much things can change. And we create better products that way. This means less meetings. This means less misunderstandings and more laughter. One of the things I always look for on really solid teams, and there is no getting it right and it stays that way forever. Again, this isn't static, but I look for laughter. People who know how to just be themselves, and it's that physical response of relaxing. And it's awesome, but it takes work. And culture's the biggest piece. If we're talking about an organization, that's gonna take time, patience, and above all else, awareness. So, measuring safety, this is all great. How do we start doing better? And how do we know if it's working? Number 1, building some awareness around some of the things I talked about. Start journaling a little bit, or if you don't journal, writing on Post-its, whatever you like, but start recognizing where you're coming from. You're not always gonna land in the same spot. Sometimes it's gonna be a couple different ones. but start paying attention to that. Additionally, as I mentioned, the work that I do as a psychological safety fearless practitioner, I go into organizations and I measure the safety of teams. This falls under 4 domains: inclusion and diversity, willingness to help, attitude to risk and failure, and open conversation. It's only 7 questions, takes about 3 minutes. And I meet briefly with the folks I'm going to talk with, so I'm not some stranger who's like, tell me all about your problems. And then we do a working agreement, much like I brought up at the beginning of this. And for 2 hours, we talk. That might sound super painful. But what I found, and I was super nervous the first time I did it, I thought, there is no way we're going to be able to talk for 2 hours. And it's not me talking, it's them. But every time, everyone wishes there was more time. Because once you start chipping away at some of the issues, you uncover all of these things. So when I do this, we actually create a roadmap. We create a behavior-based roadmap of what do we want to hold ourselves responsible to, and how would we like to change? What's next for us? What's the highest priority? Do people really not feel like they're being heard? And if they're not being heard, they're not getting their ideas out there, or they're sitting there stuck for days and we don't get our work done? It leads to solutions to a lot of problems that folks don't realize are so closely tied to behavior. This is what the scan actually looks like. So I will break it down from this broad view into the 4 domains as well with teams, but this is an actual scan that I did with an organization. And they fell at 76. That's their median PSI, which is Psychological Safety Index. That orange bar is the range of the low end and high end. The dotted line's the average. So what does 76 mean? And does it really matter? Sure, yes, it's data, it matters, but what really matters is the conversation behind it. And then I come back in 3 to 6 months and we measure again. Where did we go? Did anything get worse? Where did we do better, and how and why? Digging into all of that stuff. I mentioned the responsibility process really briefly. This is something that we teach in the psychological safety workshop. I do not have the time to dig into it here today, but trust me, I would love to do that. It is something that is really powerful and can help build awareness. It's a tool to help build awareness of where we are at any time of the day. What we think of as responsibility is different across the board. It's different for you, it's different for me. And responsibility is something that we own ourselves. Again, this is about self-awareness. It's inside us, responsibility. It's not outside, it's just with us. So if you are interested in digging more into that stuff, we have a public psychological safety workshop course that starts Monday, January 23rd. It's Mondays and Thursdays. I have a promo code here for 20% off. We do have a few early bird seats left. I am so proud of this work. We went from not really being able to fill seats 2 years ago to having sold out classes and doing them publicly, privately, all across the board. It is phenomenal work that has nothing to do with teachers being heroes. It's really about all of us learning from each other. I learned so much from this class. It is just like my favorite thing in the world to do because it's all of us showing up together and talking about real life interactions and real world stuff. It's really great. So if you're interested in digging more into the responsibility process, you can do that there as well. Some parting words before we get to Q&A. So start with small behavior changes. Don't try and do everything at once. If it feels super scary to start working on yourself, that's good. It's not a bad thing. Allow yourself to get uncomfortable. Listen to your body when you're triggered. I know that someone down here said like feeling tense when you're frustrated in a conversation. Give yourself a minute if you feel like that. Give yourself a moment to digest and breathe. Always remember to breathe before reacting. This is coming from a human who has historically been extremely reactive and still sometimes doing so, blaming dogs. But it's about learning. It's not about getting it right every time, but that maybe, just maybe, you can be a little faster to get there next time. I mentioned David. I got a little goosebumps when I brought up this picture. So I had to show some pictures of him. This was the old band, as he called it, back in 2013. And that was actually the last text I ever got from him before he passed. He was a phenomenal mentor, wonderful friend. Not perfect by any means, by the way, but owned that also. And I wish he were here with all of us today, so I just kind of wanted to throw up a little side of recognition for him, because I know there's a lot of folks in this room who knew him and loved him, and he was a good dude who we all miss severely. Also, that picture of him with the Post-it notes on his eyes, he used to do that to me on sales calls. When we were talking to like the CIO of like, I don't know, Deluxe or something, and he's like doing this. So he is sorely missed. A few links for you. So I mentioned the body keeps the score, and these slide decks I believe will be available online. The responsibility process, I couldn't dig into it today. Phenomenal book, I encourage you to pick it up. Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, and then the product podcast is actually a podcast I was on with Melissa Perry. If anyone's familiar with her work, she is amazing. She's got a great podcast where we dig into all sorts of stuff and all that and more. So Q&A. Let's do it. Questions. Yeah.
When you find yourself...
Just a second, can I talk in
Ooh.
here? Just so they can hear when you see the video, thank you.
When you find yourself digging into an organization's psychological safety and it doesn't feel like an environment that is psychologically safe, how do you encourage those people to kind of come out of their shells? Like any particular examples of how you might go about doing that?
That's a great question. How do I encourage people to show up if they can't? So a lot of this work, like anything else, is you get out of it what you put into it. And so it depends, which is the annoying response. If it's a leader who's having trouble, I think it's really looking for, like using the Mr. Rogers term, like look for the helpers, like look for people who are like sharing those feelings with you and start having conversations, but really it's starting to have conversations with yourself and doing some self-exploration that way to start. Yeah.
You mentioned starting small. What are some examples that you can do to start small with, self and teams, not to overwhelm them?
Great question. Something that you can do to start small. So I showed you the 5 F's earlier. You could do this with that or the Gottman's 4 Horsemen. Have a Post-it note, and then write down those 4 different things or those 5 different things and see how many times you catch yourself doing it in a day. And again, the reason for doing this is not to beat yourself up. It's to find patterns. Like, what sort of patterns do I have, and why do I have those patterns? So that the next time it happens, you might find yourself going there and say, whoa, am I doing that? And is this a valid response? And that I would also like to add to this, if you are feeling full of contempt, again, your feelings are totally valid. However, we don't want to perpetuate harm because it really just harms us. Nobody feels good about being a jerk most of the time, I would think. I hope. So, starting small by just doing small experiments. And then see where you land at the end of the week. And what's even better is to do it as like a buddy system at work. And you can have people who are like, hey, let's try this week. Let's try that next week and just see where we land. And also, did we find we wasted more time in meetings? Like, I love that there's now actually like data behind we're producing more of the right thing because we're actually being innovative. We're showing up as ourselves. We're not doing, if you've ever heard of groupthink, it's like everyone who just agrees to the same thing all the time because they're afraid to think outside the box. That was a long answer, sorry. Anyone else? Yeah.
Just back up and the mic over here. I don't know which one of you was first.
If you're working with an organization or a group of people where there is partial buy-in, hey, we're going to give this a try, a limited engagement, how do you turn partial buy-in into something that has momentum rather than something that gets discarded?
I say, like, the proof is kind of in the pudding in that case. So if you want to try something, then just start small and be able, just like we would do with any sort of product. And I don't care if you're working with Scrum or Kanban or whatever, like you're gonna see what you've produced at the end of a week, 2 weeks, whatever. Like what is actually starting to unfold and happen, and you can really let that speak for itself. That's where I've seen it be the most successful. Yeah.
I have a team that is half in the US and half in India. Do you have any suggestions for, helping get that psychological safety where you're dealing with extremely different cultures?
That's a great question. So something I didn't put in this presentation is something I call dynamic team mapping. So it's about getting, and we should just exchange info and I can get it to you. But it's really just about getting teams to know one another better. It's like what inspires you, what shuts you down, and it's really a good way to create a working agreement with a team who aren't all in the same place. It's what do we agree to as a team? So now each individual will do it, and then everybody kind of shares collectively, and then it's like, okay, so what of these things do we need to call out because we all have bad habits that we want to break? And now I can recognize that John says, please don't Slack me at 3 a.m. when I'm in bed. Yeah, things like that, but we can chat about that. And you had a question over here.
You saw one here?
Right there.
Okay, and then next. Okay.
Thanks. Sorry, giving you some cardio today.
That's good. Getting my steps in today.
Oh, I bet.
Where do you generally start with organizations? Do you start with like senior leaders and or like middle management? Do you it's more effective to start with like the individual teams, like and individual contributors and that like type of Agile or Scrum team? Because, obviously psychological safety is, across the enterprise. So I'm just curious, when you go into an organization, is there a place that you generally like to start with?
I mean, if I have started anywhere, I can start anywhere. What I would love would be to start higher up to be able to let leaders really know what's going on. But unfortunately, most of the time when folks get to me who are C-suite or VP, it's never too late, but it is tough. Because at this point, you're losing people all the time. Like they're starting to look at their retainment numbers. They're like, stuff is really bad. And it's not about, again, not beating yourselves up, but oftentimes, I also work with teams who are individual engineering teams or product teams who want to improve the way that they work because maybe they feel like they negatively spin all the time and they just cannot get out of their own way. Or there's another team where we have to work, across teams and they're the worst, and how do we start to rebuild that? So the answer is anywhere and everywhere, but there's so much power when leaders at a higher level lead and really own that your group shouldn't be bad to want to do that stuff. We should all want to do it because it improves the lives of all of us.
What do you suggest in cases where you have a team member that's in kind of second or third degree of separation, that's exhibiting behaviors that create issues with a sense of safety, but they're not in your direct orbit or in your team?
Can you talk a little bit more about that? So do you mean working across teams?
So if there's a particular person who occasionally makes an appearance with your team, or you hear about them having exhibited behaviors in a meeting with a team member that you weren't at, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I have been in that situation. That's a great question, and it was not an easy problem. And the problem is we can't own someone else's behavior, but what we can do is support others and support others to speak up. So it really helps to have safety in numbers in those situations. So if you hear about that happening and you are adjacent to it and you're concerned, go to a meeting. See if it happens. If it doesn't happen, that's interesting. But that's just more evidence for you and more information to figure out how can we make this more sustainable? And you kind of let the bad stuff rise to the top, because when a team starts really trusting each other and they're firing on all cylinders, doesn't mean they're perfect. People are going to blow up. People are going to have problems. But by and large, they're flowing. When someone like that kind of comes in and does it, people are going to be much more likely to say, hey, we need to address this. How can we best talk to this person? Yeah. Anyone else?
I love the work that you're describing. How can I and or we amplify this work?
That's such a great question. I'm working on a book. It's not out yet. The the best way to amplify it is showing up as human in the work that you do. Come to our class, start engaging with folks in a human way. I think that there's such misunderstanding around, I cannot deal with the word soft skills because it's not about soft skills, right? These are like human skills. This is the human condition. Recognizing that we are human first and allowing that to kind of pave the way for the greater good is so impactful. So I would say just knowing that, now I know what that buzzer is. Not scared. Knowing that we're all human and being more honest and more genuine and taking these pieces in small doses, like even taking some of these practices that we did here today and taking that to the team and being like, why don't we experiment with some of this stuff, are ways that you can just start moving the needle and you're going to see a difference. You will. Thank you. Me too. All right. Thank you all so much for showing up today. Thank you, volunteers. This is awesome. Thank you. I'll be hanging out if people want to talk, and I'll be here for the open space this afternoon, so I'm excited to pop into those. Thank you.